The city of Rome sits on 7 gentle hills in central Italy, nestled along the slow curves of a river called the Tiber. The Tiber is not a dramatic river. It moves quietly through the landscape, carrying silt and cool water down from the Apennine Mountains toward the sea. For thousands of years, people settled near its banks because the water was reliable, the soil was soft and good for growing things, and the hills offered a natural kind of shelter. This is where Rome began, not with a thunderclap or a sudden declaration, but with people finding a comfortable place to rest, to plant, and to stay. The earliest settlements on those 7 hills date back to around the 10th century before the Common Era. People built small round huts from timber and thatch, clustered together on the higher ground above the river. The huts were simple, low-roofed, warm in winter, and cool enough in summer when the breezes moved through the valley. Archaeologists have found the post holes where those ancient wooden walls once stood, small circular impressions in the earth on a hill called the Palatine. It is a quiet kind of evidence. Just the ghost of a wall, a memory pressed into the ground. The Palatine Hill was one of the most favored of the 7. It rose gently above the surrounding marshland, and from its heights you could see the river bending slowly below. Later Romans would build their finest homes there, and the word Palatine would eventually give us the word palace. But long before marble and columns, it was just a hill with a pleasant view and good, defensible ground. The 7 hills of Rome each had their own character. The Capitoline was steep and rocky, well suited for a fortified sanctuary. The Aventine lay to the south, slightly apart, and was associated in later times with the common people of the city. The Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Quirinal formed a gentler ridge to the northeast. Each hill had its own small community in those early centuries, and over many generations these communities slowly grew together into something larger. Between the hills lay low-lying ground that was often marshy and damp. The Romans would eventually drain these areas with great care, creating the Forum, an open space for gathering, trading, and public life, in what had once been a boggy valley between the Palatine and the Capitoline hills. Draining the marsh required engineering, patience, and collective effort, and it is rather fitting that the very heart of Roman civic life was built on ground that had first been tamed and made habitable through human ingenuity. The Romans told a story about their city's founding that involved twin brothers named Romulus and Remus. According to the legend, they were the sons of a god and a priestess, set adrift as infants on the Tiber and eventually suckled by a she-wolf near the foot of the Palatine Hill. A shepherd found them and raised them, and when they grew they decided to found a city. They disagreed about which hill to build it on, and in the quarrel Romulus killed his brother and became the city's first king. Rome, in this telling, was named for Romulus. The Romans themselves treated this story with varying degrees of seriousness. Some considered it a meaningful mythological origin, connecting the city to divine ancestry. Others regarded it more as a familiar tale, the kind of story a city tells about itself to give shape to its beginnings. What the story does capture, in its own way, is something true about Rome, that it was a place built through will, through conflict resolved into order, and through the determination of people who intended to stay. Rome had 7 kings, according to tradition, before it became a republic. The period of kings is hazy and ancient, and much of what we know comes from later Roman writers who were themselves working from older, partly mythologized sources. The kings were said to have ruled from around the 8th century to the late 6th century before the Common Era. Some of them were remembered as wise builders and lawgivers. One king, Numa Pompilius, was remembered as peaceful and deeply religious, a man who organized the calendar and established many of Rome's early religious practices. Another, Servius Tullius, was credited with organizing Roman society into classes and creating the city's first census. The last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, whose name means the proud or the arrogant, was remembered as a tyrant. The Romans expelled him around 509 before the Common Era and decided they would never again be ruled by a single person with unchecked power. From this decision grew the Roman Republic, one of the most thoughtfully constructed systems of shared governance the ancient world would ever produce. The Republic was built on a simple and careful idea that power should always be divided, balanced, and temporary. The highest offices in the Republic were held by 2 consuls, elected each year, each with the ability to veto the decisions of the other. The word veto is Latin, meaning I forbid, and it remains in use today in many governments around the world. The consuls commanded the army, oversaw the government, and presided over the Senate, but their power was always checked and always time-limited. After their year in office, they returned to ordinary life as senators. The Senate was the great deliberative body of the Republic. It was composed of several hundred members, drawn from the aristocratic class of Rome, and it met in a building called the Curia, a word that would eventually give us the name for the court of the Catholic Church. Senators debated policy, managed finances, oversaw foreign affairs, and gave guidance to the magistrates who ran the day-to-day business of the state. Debates could be long and careful, conducted with formal courtesy and attention to procedure. Roman senators were proud of their institution and their tradition of deliberation. Below the consuls in the hierarchy of Roman office were many other positions: praetors who administered justice, quaestors who handled finances, censors who conducted the census and maintained public morality, and aediles who oversaw the city's buildings, markets, and public games. Each position had its own responsibilities and its own term of service. The whole system was designed to ensure that no single person accumulated too much power for too long. There was also the office of dictator, which sounds alarming to modern ears but was in the Roman system a carefully defined emergency role. In times of severe crisis, the Senate could appoint a dictator for a period of no more than 6 months to manage the emergency with unified authority. When the crisis passed, the dictator was expected to resign and return power to the regular system. Most did exactly that, and the Romans remembered those who relinquished power voluntarily with great admiration. A man named Cincinnatus was called from his farm to serve as dictator, handled the emergency in 15 days, and then returned to his plowing. He became a symbol of republican virtue, and his name was given to a city in what is now the state of Ohio. Roman society in the Republic was divided in ways that shaped almost every aspect of life. The patricians were the old aristocratic families, those whose ancestors had been among the founding class of Rome. They held traditional religious and political privileges. The plebeians were everyone else, the vast majority of Roman citizens, ranging from prosperous farmers and merchants to the very poor. In the early Republic, plebeians were excluded from many offices and from certain religious institutions, and much of the political history of the Middle Republic is the story of how plebeians gradually won more rights and representation. The struggle of the orders, as historians call it, was a long, mostly peaceful contest in which plebeians used their indispensable role in the army as leverage to win concessions from the patrician class. One of the most important outcomes was the creation of the tribunes of the plebs, elected officials who could intercede on behalf of any citizen and whose persons were considered sacred and inviolable. Another was the codification of Roman law into the 12 Tables, a set of laws written down and publicly displayed so that everyone could know what the rules were. The idea that law should be written, public, and accessible to all citizens was one of Rome's most enduring contributions to human civilization. Roman law grew slowly and carefully over centuries. It began with those early 12 tables and expanded through the decisions of praetors, the opinions of legal scholars, and the decrees of emperors. Roman lawyers and jurists developed sophisticated concepts that still underlie many legal systems today: the presumption of innocence, the idea that a person should be judged by the evidence rather than by accusation, the distinction between intent and accident in determining guilt, the notion of legal personhood for organizations and institutions. Much of what we consider normal and obvious in modern law traces quietly back to those Roman jurists working in their studies, thinking carefully about how to make the rules of society fair and consistent. As the Republic grew more confident, it began to expand beyond the Italian peninsula. The expansion was gradual and often reactive. Rome would go to war with a neighboring people, defeat them, and then find itself drawn into the affairs of the next people beyond. By the 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome controlled most of the Italian peninsula and was beginning to look outward across the Mediterranean. The great contests of this period were the Punic Wars against Carthage, a powerful city-state on the northern coast of Africa in what is now Tunisia. Carthage controlled much of the western Mediterranean trade and had a formidable navy. Rome was primarily a land power, but it adapted with remarkable speed, building a fleet and learning naval warfare almost from scratch. The First Punic War was fought largely at sea and lasted more than 20 years. Rome won. The Second Punic War brought the Carthaginian general Hannibal across the Alps with his army and his famous war elephants, through Spain and into Italy itself, where he spent 15 years campaigning on Roman soil and winning many battles. Rome did not collapse. It absorbed the losses, continued raising armies, and eventually carried the war back to Africa, where the general Scipio defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 before the Common Era. The Third Punic War ended with the complete destruction of Carthage, its buildings torn down, its people sold into slavery, its ground reportedly salted, though modern historians debate whether the salting actually happened. Rome's expansion brought great wealth and great complexity. The influx of slaves from conquered territories changed the nature of Roman agriculture and labor. Large estates called latifundia, worked by slaves, spread across the countryside, squeezing out the small farmers who had been the backbone of the Roman army. Many of these displaced farmers drifted into the cities, especially Rome, swelling the urban poor. The gap between the very wealthy and the very poor widened, and the political system came under strain. The reforms proposed by the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus in the 2nd century before the Common Era were attempts to address these problems by redistributing public land. Both brothers were killed by their political opponents, a sign that Roman politics was becoming more violent, that the old norms of deliberation and restraint were fraying. The armies, which had once been composed of citizens with their own property and a stake in the Republic, were reformed by a general named Marius into professional forces whose loyalty was increasingly to their commander rather than to the state. This shift, subtle as it was, would prove deeply consequential. The first century before the Common Era was a time of tremendous turbulence in the Roman Republic. Ambitious generals used their armies to pursue political ends. Sulla marched on Rome twice. Marius and Sulla fought a civil war. The Italian allies fought the social war to gain Roman citizenship. Spartacus led a great slave uprising that kept the Roman army occupied for 2 years. Pirates threatened the Mediterranean trade routes until the general Pompey swept them away in a remarkably efficient campaign. Rome was in constant motion, constant crisis, and yet the machinery of the Republic kept turning, the Senate kept debating, the elections kept being held. Julius Caesar was born into this world in 100 before the Common Era, a member of an old but not especially wealthy patrician family. He was intelligent, charming, physically brave, and possessed of an extraordinary ability to inspire loyalty in the people around him. He was also deeply ambitious and keenly aware of the political currents of his time. He served in Spain, won military victories, returned to Rome, and maneuvered his way into alliances with the richest man in Rome, Marcus Crassus, and with the most celebrated general of the age, Pompey. Together they formed what is called the First Triumvirate, an informal but powerful arrangement that allowed them to dominate Roman politics for a time. Caesar spent 9 years conquering Gaul, the region that is now France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. He wrote about these campaigns himself in a plain, clear Latin that Romans and later readers admired greatly. The Gallic Wars expanded Roman territory enormously, brought great wealth and slaves to Rome, and made Caesar extraordinarily popular with the Roman people and fiercely dangerous in the eyes of his political opponents. When the Senate ordered him to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar understood that doing so would expose him to prosecution and political destruction. In 49 before the Common Era, he crossed the Rubicon, a small river in northern Italy that marked the boundary of Roman Italy and beyond which no general was permitted to bring his army, and march toward Rome. This was an act of civil war. The phrase crossing the Rubicon has come to mean any point of no return, any decisive, irreversible step. The civil war that followed was relatively brief. Pompey fled to Greece and was eventually murdered in Egypt. Caesar pursued his opponents across the Mediterranean and defeated them one by one. He returned to Rome as the unquestioned master of the Roman world and was appointed dictator, at first for short terms and then for life. He implemented many reforms, reorganized the calendar, extended Roman citizenship, began ambitious building projects, and planned campaigns against Parthia in the east. His methods were often merciful by ancient standards. He pardoned many of his enemies and invited them back into public life. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, in 44 before the Common Era, a group of senators who feared Caesar intended to make himself a king stabbed him to death in a hall adjacent to the theatre of Pompey. He was struck 23 times. The assassins believed they were saving the Republic. They were not. The murder of Caesar plunged Rome into another decade of civil war. His great-nephew and adopted heir, Octavian, allied first with Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony and then fought against him when they could not agree on how to divide power. The final battle came at Actium in 31 before the Common Era, where Octavian's forces defeated the combined fleet of Mark Antony and the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Mark Antony and Cleopatra both died by their own hands, and Octavian returned to Rome the master of the entire Roman world. What Octavian did next was careful and brilliant. He did not declare himself king. He did not abolish the Senate or the traditional offices of the Republic. Instead, he accumulated titles and powers one by one, each individually justifiable, together creating something entirely new, a monarchy in republican clothing. He called himself Princeps, meaning first citizen, and later took the honorific name Augustus, meaning the revered one. He restored the outward forms of the Republic while ensuring that all real power rested with him. He held tribunician power, which made his person sacred and gave him the power of veto. He held proconsular power over the provinces where the armies were stationed, which meant he controlled the military. He had wealth, prestige, and the loyalty of the soldiers. The Senate continued to meet, continued to pass laws, continued to elect consuls, but understood that it served at the pleasure of Augustus. The reign of Augustus lasted 44 years, from 27 before the Common Era to 14 of the Common Era. It was a period of remarkable stability after generations of civil war, and the Romans were deeply grateful for the peace. Augustus rebuilt Rome in marble. He famously said he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, and embellished it with temples, forums, and public spaces of extraordinary beauty. He sponsored poets and historians. The Aeneid of Virgil, the Odes of Horace, the Elegies of Ovid, the Histories of Livy, all were products of this Augustan age, works that would be read and admired for the next 2,000 years. The period that followed Augustus is called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a stretch of roughly 2 centuries during which the Roman Empire was largely at peace within its borders and the economy, trade, and culture flourished. The empire at its greatest extent stretched from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the deserts of Africa in the south. Within this vast territory, a person could travel on well-maintained roads from one end to the other, speaking Latin in the west and Greek in the east, using Roman currency, staying at roadside inns, and enjoying the security of Roman law and Roman order. The roads are among the most tangible of Rome's achievements. The Romans built approximately 85,000 kilometers of roads across their empire, carefully engineered to drain water, resist frost, and carry heavy traffic. They were built in layers, a foundation of large stones, a middle layer of smaller gravel, and a top surface of fitted flat stones. They were cambered, meaning they were slightly higher in the middle so that rainwater ran off to the sides into drainage ditches. Many Roman roads remained in use for centuries after the empire fell, and some are still visible today as straight lines through fields and forests, or as the foundations beneath modern highways. Roman roads were not just military conveniences. They enabled commerce, communication, and the movement of people across the empire. Merchants carried goods from Spain to Syria, from Egypt to Britain. The postal system, the cursus publicus, used relay stations along the roads to carry official messages at remarkable speed. Travelers could cover roughly 50 kilometers a day on the roads, and messengers riding hard could cover much more. The roads gave the empire a nervous system, a way of holding its vast territories together through constant movement and connection. The aqueducts are perhaps even more remarkable. Rome, a city of perhaps 1 million people at its height, required enormous quantities of fresh water every day, for drinking, for the public fountains that were the primary water source for most residents, for the public baths, for the laundries, for the gardens of the wealthy. The aqueducts carried water from mountain springs and rivers dozens of kilometers away, flowing gently downhill along precisely calculated gradients, through tunnels and across arched bridges, into the city where it was distributed through a network of lead and ceramic pipes. There were 11 major aqueducts supplying Rome by the imperial period, delivering hundreds of millions of liters of water every day. The engineering required to build them, surveying accurate gradients across complex terrain, constructing arched bridges strong enough to carry the weight of water over valleys, tunneling through hills, was extraordinary. The longest Roman aqueduct ran for nearly 90 kilometers. The water it carried reached the city at a rate of flow that has been calculated as roughly equal to the water needs of a modern city of similar size. The public baths, or thermae, were one of the great social institutions of Roman city life. In Rome itself, the largest baths could accommodate thousands of visitors at a time. They contained not just bathing pools of different temperatures, cool, warm, and hot, but also exercise rooms, gardens, libraries, shops, and spaces for conversation and socializing. The admission fee was very low, often subsidized by wealthy patrons or by the state, so that people of all classes could use them. Romans bathed daily and regarded cleanliness as both a personal virtue and a civic one. A Roman going to the baths would typically begin in a changing room called the appetiterium, leave their clothes in a cubby, move through a series of increasingly warm rooms, the tepidarium and caldarium, sweating out impurities, and then cool down in the frigidarium. They would be scraped with a curved metal tool called a strigil to remove oil, sweat, and dirt from the skin. The baths were heated by a sophisticated underfloor heating system called the hypocaust, in which hot air from a furnace circulated beneath raised floors and through hollow walls, warming the rooms gently from below and all around. Roman architecture made permanent the things the Romans valued most: order, durability, public generosity, and the demonstration of power through beauty. The arch was one of their signature structural elements, allowing them to span much wider spaces than the simple post and lintel construction used by the Greeks. The barrel vault and the groin vault allowed them to cover large interior spaces without intermediate columns. The dome, reached through the combination of arches rotated around a central point, allowed them to create interior spaces of extraordinary grandeur. The Pantheon in Rome, built during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century of the Common Era, is perhaps the most perfect surviving example of Roman architectural genius. It is a temple with a circular interior topped by a great dome, the oculus, an open eye at the dome's summit, letting in a circle of daylight that moves slowly across the walls and floor as the day progresses. The dome is 142 feet in diameter, and for more than 1,300 years after it was built it remained the largest dome in the world. It still stands today, remarkably intact, used continuously as a place of worship for nearly 2,000 years. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was one of the technologies that made these architectural achievements possible. It was made from volcanic ash, lime, seawater, and aggregate, and it set and hardened even underwater, making it ideal for harbor construction and foundations. Unlike modern concrete, which tends to crack and deteriorate over centuries, Roman concrete has been found to actually strengthen over time in some conditions, as certain chemical reactions continue within the material long after it sets. Modern scientists studying ancient Roman harbor structures have found them in remarkable condition, and the study of Roman concrete has informed contemporary materials research. The Forum was the center of Roman civic life, a paved open space surrounded by temples, government buildings, and the spaces where legal and commercial business was conducted. Rome's original Forum, the Forum Romanum, lay in the valley between the Capitoline and Palatine hills. As the city grew and the demands on public space increased, successive emperors added their own forums adjacent to the original, each one grander than the last. The Forum of Trajan, the largest, was designed by an architect named Apollodorus of Damascus and featured a great columned hall, 2 libraries, a broad plaza, and the famous Trajan's Column, a marble column carved in a continuous spiral relief depicting Trajan's campaigns in Dacia, more than 2,000 figures carved in stone, winding upward for 30 meters. Trajan's Column still stands in Rome, the carved figures still visible, still telling their quiet story of soldiers marching, rivers being crossed, battles being fought, and a distant people being conquered. It is a strange and wonderful object, a stone photograph of a world more than 1900 years gone, preserved in remarkable detail because the Romans cut their stone with uncommon skill and care. The Colosseum is perhaps the most recognized building of the ancient world. It was built beginning in the reign of the Emperor Vespasian, completed under his son Titus, and dedicated in 80 of the Common Era with 100 days of games. It could hold between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators, arranged by social class on different tiers, senators at the front in marble seats, then the equestrian class, then ordinary citizens, and finally women and the poor at the very top. The structure was made of travertine limestone, concrete, and brick, held together partly by iron clamps, many of which were removed in the medieval period when the Colosseum became a source of building materials for the rest of the city. The arena floor of the Colosseum was made of wood covered with sand, the Latin word for sand being arena, which is where we get our word. Beneath the floor lay a complex of tunnels, cages, lifts, and machinery called the hypogeum, through which animals, gladiators, scenery, and condemned prisoners could be moved before being raised dramatically through trapdoors onto the arena floor above. The machinery included wooden elevators operated by ropes and counterweights, capable of lifting a caged lion or a platform of scenery up through the floor in a matter of seconds. The gladiatorial games were a central part of Roman public entertainment, but they were also more complex than the simple spectacle of violence they are sometimes reduced to. Gladiators were expensive to train and equip, and their deaths were not the primary object of the games. A skilled gladiator was a valuable investment, trained for years at schools called ludi, fed well, given medical care, and matched against opponents of roughly equal skill. The crowd could signal mercy or death for a fallen fighter, and a gladiator who had fought bravely and well was more likely to be spared. Many gladiators survived multiple fights and eventually won their freedom. Gladiators came from different backgrounds: prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and sometimes volunteers who signed contracts for a term of service in exchange for training, food, and the chance to win prizes and fame. Some gladiators became genuinely celebrated figures, their names scratched admiringly on walls, their portraits painted. Graffiti from Pompeii records the enthusiasm of fans for particular fighters, in language not entirely unlike modern sports fandom. There were different types of gladiators, each with a distinct set of weapons and armor. The heavily armored Secutor fought the lightly armed Retiarius, who carried a net and a trident. The Thrakes used a curved short sword and a small shield. The Mamillo was more heavily armed, with a large shield and a straight sword. The differences in equipment made for varied and interesting fights, each type having advantages and disadvantages against the others. The pairing of gladiators was done with attention to spectacle. A contest should be interesting to watch, which meant reasonably balanced. The games also included staged animal hunts called venations, in which trained fighters called venators or bestiarii hunted exotic animals brought from across the empire: lions, leopards, bears, crocodiles, hippopotamuses, ostriches, and many others. The logistics of capturing these animals in Africa and Asia, shipping them to Rome, and keeping them healthy and fierce until they appeared in the arena was a remarkable operation, sustained over centuries, and had a significant impact on the wildlife populations of the regions where the animals were collected. Outside the arena and the grand public spaces, daily life in Rome was the life of a very large, very dense city. Most Romans lived in multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. The word means island, which rose 4 to 6 stories high in the crowded neighborhoods away from the wealthy hilltop districts. The ground floor of an insula was often occupied by shops, which opened directly onto the street. The upper floors were divided into rental apartments of varying sizes and quality, with the best apartments on the lower floors and the least desirable, hottest in summer and coldest in winter, at the top. The apartments were small by modern standards. Most lacked running water and relied on public fountains for drinking and cooking water. They had no toilets, and residents used chamber pots emptied into street-level containers, or visited the public latrines, large communal toilet rooms where rows of seats were positioned over channels of running water, and where conversation was apparently conducted without the inhibition of privacy. The public latrines of Rome were sociable places, and Romans do not seem to have found them awkward. Cooking in an insular apartment was done on small portable braziers, as the apartments had no built-in hearths. The risk of fire was a constant concern in the densely packed wooden upper floors of the insulae, and Rome suffered several catastrophic fires, most famously the Great Fire of 64 of the Common Era during the reign of Nero, which burned for 6 days and destroyed much of the city. Augustus had established Rome's first organized fire brigade, the Vigils, a corps of freedmen who served as both firefighters and night watchmen. Even so, fire remained one of the great hazards of urban life. The street life of Rome was vivid and busy. Vendors sold food from stalls and small shops: bread, olives, wine, cooked sausages, fried fish, and pastries. Bakeries were common, their stone mills and ovens familiar features of every neighborhood. Many Romans ate their main meal at a thermopolium, a kind of ancient fast food counter with a stone counter containing deep ceramic jars set into the surface, keeping food warm for sale. Archaeologists have found dozens of well-preserved thermopolia at Pompeii, some with the remains of the food still in the pots: duck, pork, fish, lentils, and grain. The Roman diet was based on wheat, olive oil, and wine, the three great products of Mediterranean agriculture. Bread was central to every meal. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, for cleaning the body, and for 100 other purposes. Wine was drunk diluted with water, and drinking undiluted wine was considered a sign of poor character, something barbaric peoples did. Garum, a fermented fish sauce, was the great condiment of Roman cooking, added to almost everything the way salt or soy sauce is used today. It was produced in large quantities along the Atlantic coast of Spain and Portugal and shipped in ceramic amphorae across the empire. The Roman day was organized around the hours of sunlight, which were divided into 12 equal parts regardless of the season. This meant that a summer hour was longer than a winter one. The first hour of the day began at sunrise. Romans rose early, conducted their business in the morning hours when it was coolest, ate their main meal in the early afternoon, and rested during the hottest part of the day. Evening was for socializing, bathing, and more leisurely meals among friends. Wealthy Romans lived in very different conditions than the poor. The domus, the single-family townhouse of the prosperous, was arranged around a central open-air courtyard called the atrium, which contained a shallow pool for collecting rainwater. Beyond the atrium lay more rooms, another courtyard called the peristyle surrounded by a colonnade and often containing a garden, and the private rooms of the family. The walls were decorated with painted frescoes, the floors with mosaic tiles, and the furniture was of fine wood, bronze, and ivory. The houses were comfortable, quiet, and private in a way that the insulae were not. The wealthy also had country estates called villae, some of which were working farms and others of which were primarily leisure retreats. The villa of the Papyri near Herculaneum, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era and still only partially excavated, contained a magnificent collection of Greek and Roman bronze sculptures and an enormous library of papyrus scrolls. The scrolls, carbonized by the heat of the eruption, have been partially read using X-ray technology and other modern techniques, and researchers are still working to recover their texts. The eruption of Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum was witnessed by a young Roman named Pliny the Younger, who described it in 2 letters that survive. He wrote of a great cloud rising from the mountain in the shape of a pine tree, of ash falling like snow, of darkness at midday, of the sea retreating from the shore. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, the great naturalist and encyclopedist, died in the eruption, having sailed toward the mountain to observe it more closely and to help people trapped on the shore. Pliny the Younger's letters are among the most precise and moving eyewitness accounts of a natural disaster from the ancient world. The cities of the Roman Empire beyond Rome itself varied in size, character, and local culture, but shared the common infrastructure of Roman urban life. Almost every Roman city of any size had a forum, a basilica for conducting legal business, a temple or several, a theatre, an amphitheatre, public baths, and a water supply brought by aqueduct. The layout of Roman cities, especially those founded as new colonies, often followed a regular grid plan based on military camp design. two main streets crossing at right angles, the Cardo running north-south and the Decumanus running east-west, with smaller streets creating a regular grid. The theatre was another important civic space. Roman theatres were built as permanent stone structures, unlike the temporary wooden ones of the early Republic or the hillside theatres of the Greeks. They featured a semicircular seating area called the cavea, a raised stage, and an elaborate architectural backdrop called the scaenae fronts. Roman plays included comedies, tragedies, and a form of broad popular entertainment called mime. The comedies of Plautus and Terence, written in the 2nd century before the Common Era, are among the earliest Latin literature to survive, and they influenced European theatre for the next 2,000 years. Latin was the language of the Western Roman Empire, and it spread across Gaul, Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and Britain through the processes of military settlement, administration, and commerce. The local languages did not disappear immediately, but over generations Latin became dominant, and the spoken Latin of ordinary people in each region gradually evolved into what would become, after the fall of the empire, the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, and others. The words people use every day in those languages carry within them the bones of ancient Latin, slightly changed and worn smooth by time. Greek remained the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean throughout the Roman period. When Romans of the educated class wanted to read philosophy, science, or literature, they read it in Greek. Greek tutors taught Roman children, and it was considered essential for any cultivated Roman to be fluent in both Latin and Greek. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled in the 2nd century of the Common Era, wrote his private philosophical reflections, the work now known as the Meditations, in Greek, the language he found most natural for thinking through difficult things. Roman religion was woven through every aspect of life. The Romans believed in a large and loosely organized pantheon of gods, each associated with particular domains of nature, human activity, or cosmic order. Jupiter was the king of the gods, associated with the sky and thunder. Juno was his wife, the goddess of marriage and women's life. Mars was the god of war, and because Rome was above all a military city, Mars held a position of special honor. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom and crafts. Neptune ruled the sea, Ceres oversaw the grain and the harvest, Mercury was the god of commerce and messages, and Venus presided over love and beauty. The Romans also adopted gods and religious practices from the peoples they conquered and traded with, incorporating them into their own religious system with remarkable openness. Cybele, a great mother goddess from Anatolia, was formally introduced to Rome during the Second Punic War when an oracle indicated she would help Rome defeat Hannibal. Isis and Osiris, the great Egyptian divinities, developed devoted followings in Rome. Mithras, a deity associated with light and cosmic order whose worship spread from Persia, became popular especially among soldiers. Roman religion was accommodating in this way. It did not insist on exclusive devotion and generally welcomed new divine presences into the fold. Religious practice in Rome centered on ritual rather than on doctrine. The proper performance of sacrifices, prayers, and ceremonies was what mattered, and this was handled by a series of priestly colleges, organized groups of men and women with specific religious responsibilities. The Vestal Virgins were among the most important, 6 women who maintained the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, in her round temple in the Forum. The fire was never allowed to go out, and the Vestals tended it in rotation for 30 years of service, during which they remained celibate and held special social privileges. If the fire went out, it was considered a very bad omen for Rome, and the Vestal responsible was punished. Augury, the interpretation of omens, was a serious and formal practice. Trained priests called augurs observed the flight of birds, the behavior of sacred chickens, and other natural signs to determine whether the gods favored a proposed action. Before a battle, before founding a city, before undertaking any significant venture, the Romans consulted the augurs. The chickens were especially practical. They were carried with armies on campaign, and if they ate eagerly from their feed before a battle, it was a good omen. One Roman general, told that his chickens refused to eat before a naval engagement, reportedly threw them into the sea and said that if they wouldn't eat, they could drink. He lost the battle. The spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire is one of the most significant religious developments in world history, and it happened gradually and within the structures of Roman society and culture. Christianity began as a small Jewish sect in the province of Judea in the 1st century of the Common Era. Its followers believed that Jesus of Nazareth, executed by crucifixion under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, was the promised Messiah and had risen from the dead. The message spread quickly through the Jewish diaspora communities scattered across the empire's cities, and then outward into the broader population. The Apostle Paul, a Jewish Roman citizen whose letters are among the earliest Christian documents, traveled extensively through the eastern Mediterranean and into Greece and Rome itself, establishing communities of believers in city after city. He wrote in Greek, used the Roman road network for his journeys, and argued his case before Roman authorities using his rights as a citizen. The infrastructure of the Roman Empire, in a real sense, enabled the spread of Christianity. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Christians were sometimes persecuted by Roman authorities, though the persecution was intermittent and varied greatly by location and period rather than being constant. The fundamental tension was that Christians refused to worship the Roman gods or to offer sacrifice to the divine emperor, which Romans regarded as a civic duty rather than a purely religious one. This refusal made Christians seem politically unreliable. The persecutions under Nero and later under Diocletian were particularly severe, but they did not prevent the faith from growing. In 313 of the Common Era, the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which extended tolerance to Christians and all other religions throughout the empire. Constantine himself converted to Christianity, the first Roman emperor to do so, and the faith's position in the empire changed rapidly. By the end of the 4th century, under the Emperor Theodosius, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman state, and the old polytheistic temples were gradually closed or converted to other uses. The figure of Constantine is complex and fascinating. He ruled during a period of great political instability, reunified an empire that had been divided between competing rulers, founded a new eastern capital at the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, which he named Constantinople, the city of Constantine, and which is now Istanbul, and set the Roman Empire on a new religious and cultural trajectory. The eastern part of the empire that he helped stabilize would survive as the Byzantine Empire for more than 1,000 years after the Western Empire fell. The 3rd century of the Common Era was a period of deep crisis for the Roman Empire, a span of about 50 years during which the empire came very close to complete disintegration. Emperors came and went with shocking speed, most of them soldiers elevated by their troops and then killed by other soldiers when they failed to perform. There were perhaps 20 or more emperors in 50 years, a rate of turnover that made stable governance almost impossible. The borders were under pressure from Gothic tribes in the north and from the revitalized Persian Empire of the Sassanids in the east. The economy suffered from the disruption of trade, the debasement of the currency, and the enormous cost of constant military campaigns. The empire was eventually stabilized by a series of capable soldier emperors in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, most notably Diocletian, who reorganized the government, the army, and the tax system, and divided the empire for administrative purposes between multiple rulers. This administrative division, a practical response to the sheer size of the empire and the simultaneous demands of multiple frontiers, foreshadowed the permanent division that would come later. The division of the empire into western and eastern halves became permanent in 395 of the Common Era, after the death of Theodosius. The Western Roman Empire, centered on Rome and Milan and later Ravenna, controlled Italy, Gaul, Spain, Britain, and North Africa. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, controlled Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. The East was more urbanized, more prosperous, and better defensible. The West faced constant pressure from the Germanic peoples beyond the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The relationship between the Roman Empire and the Germanic peoples to its north and east was long and complicated. The Romans had traded with, recruited from, and fought against Germanic tribes for centuries. Many Germanic men served in the Roman army, rising to high rank, learning Latin, and absorbing Roman culture. Many Germanic communities were settled inside the empire's boundaries as federates, peoples who were permitted to live on Roman land in exchange for military service. The line between Roman citizen and Germanic newcomer had been blurring for generations. When the Hunnic invasions from Central Asia drove the Gothic peoples westward and into Roman territory in the late 4th century, the Western Empire found itself unable to absorb or repel the newcomers at the scale now required. In 410, the Visigoths under their leader Alaric sacked Rome, the first time an outside force had entered and plundered the city in 800 years. It was a shock of enormous symbolic weight, even though much of the city survived intact and the Visigoths departed after 3 days. The event crystallized the sense that the old order was giving way. The Western Empire continued to function in diminished form for another 66 years after the sack by Alaric. It managed some recoveries and some periods of relative stability, but the underlying structural problems, the inability to pay and supply adequate armies, the loss of tax revenue as provinces were overrun or detached, the political instability at the top, proved insurmountable. By the mid-5th century, the Western Emperor was largely a figurehead, with real power in the hands of military commanders, many of them of Germanic origin. The date traditionally given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire is 476 of the Common Era, when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, the name combining those of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor in a poignant and perhaps ironic conjunction. Odoacer did not declare a new empire. He simply ruled Italy as a king, sending the imperial insignia to Constantinople and acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the nominal sovereign of a now unified empire. The Western Empire ended not with a dramatic final battle but with a quiet administrative act, a piece of paperwork, a crown laid down. Historians have debated for centuries why the Roman Empire fell, generating hundreds of explanations ranging from military overextension to economic decay, from political dysfunction to climate change, from religious transformation to the gradual depletion of soil fertility in the Italian countryside. Edward Gibbon, the great 18th-century historian who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 6 volumes, blamed in part the spread of Christianity for softening Roman civic virtue. Modern historians tend to see the fall as the product of many interacting factors over a long period, a slow transformation rather than a sudden collapse. What is clear is that the fall of the Western Empire did not mean the end of Roman civilization. Roman culture, Latin language, Roman law, and Roman administrative traditions continued in the new kingdoms that replaced the empire, among the Visigoths in Spain, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy. The Catholic Church, which had become the universal institution of Western Christianity, preserved Latin learning, maintained schools and libraries, and sustained a network of connection across the fragmented West. The papacy in Rome gave the city a new kind of centrality even as its political power diminished. In the East, the Byzantine Empire continued as an explicitly Roman state, calling itself the Roman Empire and its citizens Romans, for nearly 1,000 more years, until Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. The Byzantine emperors saw themselves as the legitimate heirs of Augustus and Constantine, and in some ways they were right. Byzantine law was based on Roman law. Byzantine administration used Latin terms. The Eastern Church preserved Greek learning. The tradition continued, changed and adapted, but unbroken. The legacy of Rome in the modern world is so deep and so pervasive that it is difficult to see clearly precisely because it is everywhere. The legal systems of France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and their former colonies around the world are based on Roman law. The common law system of Britain and its former colonies, though developed separately, was deeply influenced by Roman legal concepts and procedures. The presumption of innocence, the right to face one's accusers, the idea of a written constitution limiting the power of government, all these trace threads back to Roman republican thought. The architecture of public buildings throughout the Western world bears the mark of Rome. The domes of government buildings, the columns of courthouses and banks, the arches of triumphal entries and bridges, all reflect the vocabulary of Roman architecture transmitted through the Renaissance, when Italian artists and architects returned to the study of ancient Roman buildings with fresh eyes and found in them the principles of beauty and proportion they had been seeking. The Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, Catalan, are the direct descendants of Latin, evolved over 15 centuries of spoken use. English, though primarily a Germanic language, contains an enormous proportion of Latin-derived vocabulary, most of it absorbed through French after the Norman conquest of 1066 and through the scholarly and ecclesiastical Latin of the medieval Church. Words like justice, liberty, senate, constitution, republic, architecture, agriculture, education, religion, calendar, and thousands more come directly from Latin. Roman words are present in almost every sentence of intellectual or civic English. The calendar we use today, the Gregorian calendar, is a minor correction of the Julian calendar introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 before the Common Era, which replaced the older Roman lunar calendar with a solar year of 365 days and a leap year every 4 years. The months of our calendar retain their Latin names. July is named for Julius Caesar, August for Augustus. September, October, November, and December preserve the Latin numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10. They were originally the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months of the older Roman calendar before January and February were added at the beginning. The 7-day week, while not a Roman invention, received its final standardization through Roman imperial administration and was transmitted across Europe through the Roman Church and Roman cultural influence. The names of the days in the Romance languages come from the Roman names: dies Luni for Monday, the day of the moon; dies Martis for Tuesday, the day of Mars; dies Mercurii for Wednesday, the day of Mercury, and so on. The English names of the days substitute Germanic gods for Roman ones, but the structure is the same. Roman engineering concepts survived in practice throughout the medieval period and fed directly into the great building programs of Gothic cathedrals and medieval cities. The arch, the vault, and the principles of load distribution that Roman engineers had worked out in stone and concrete were never entirely forgotten, and when Renaissance engineers began studying Roman structures, they found themselves rediscovering principles they could then apply on a new scale. The political vocabulary of modern democracy and republicanism is saturated with Roman terms and concepts. Senate, republic, constitution, consul, dictator, veto, civic, citizen. All these words come from Latin, and they carry with them the weight of the Roman political tradition that first gave them meaning. The founders of the American Republic studied classical antiquity intensively, read Cicero and Polybius and Livy, and consciously modeled many aspects of the new American government on Roman Republican precedents. The Senate, the concept of 3 branches of government, the idea of written constitutional limits on executive power, all reflect this engagement with the Roman past. The phrase annuit coeptis that appears on the American dollar bill is a line from Virgil's Aeneid, meaning he has approved our undertakings. The phrase novus ordo seclorum, also on the dollar bill, is adapted from another line of Virgil, meaning a new order of the ages. The founders of a new republic reaching back to the poetry of the Augustan age to find words for their aspirations, that is a measure of how deeply Rome had made itself part of the furniture of the educated Western mind. The Roman Catholic Church, whose headquarters remains in Rome to this day, is in many ways the direct institutional continuation of the Roman Empire, using Latin as its official language until very recently organized along the lines of Roman provincial administration, and claiming universal authority in a form that mirrors the claims of the Roman imperial state. The Pope's title of Pontifex Maximus was a title of the chief Roman priest before it was adopted by Christian bishops of Rome. The word diocese, used for a bishop's administrative area, was originally a Roman administrative division. The church calendar, the liturgical year, the organization of monasteries and convents, all were shaped by Roman administrative and cultural models. The ruins of Rome and of Roman buildings throughout Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa have been an object of fascination, study, and inspiration for every generation since the empire fell. Travelers in the medieval period came to Rome to see its ancient monuments. Renaissance artists sketched and measured Roman buildings and sculptures to learn their proportions. 18th-century travelers on the Grand Tour made Rome a required destination. Today, millions of visitors each year walk the paths through the Forum Romanum, stand in the shadow of the Colosseum, pass through the dim interior of the Pantheon, and feel in those places a connection to a world that was in many ways very different from our own and yet also, in ways that can be surprising, recognizably familiar. The Romans were people who cared about the lasting impression of their work. They built in stone and concrete precisely because they wanted their buildings to endure. They inscribed their laws, their honors, and their dedications on marble precisely because they knew marble lasts. They wrote histories and preserved them in libraries because they understood that the record of what had been done was itself valuable. They were not naive about impermanence. The Roman Stoic philosophers wrote extensively about the transience of all things, but they tried, anyway, to make things that would outlast them. And they did, in a way that has few parallels in human history. The roads are still in the earth. The aqueducts still carry water in some places. The laws are still in the codes. The words are still in the languages. The buildings are still standing, worn and partial but unmistakably themselves. And in the quiet way that old things persist, the world that Romans built and the thoughts they thought and the arrangements they made for living together still shape the way we build and think and live, so gently and so thoroughly that most of the time we do not notice it at all, the way a person does not notice the rhythm of their own breathing until they stop to pay attention.